Chess friends, I hope your neurons are still firing properly today, because the Silicon Emperor has arrived. The Kaiser chess engine, a highly technical and statistical female chess AI, stepped into the arena with tactical precision sharp enough to make a surgeon jealous. Today I faced her at the monstrous level of 4000 Elo, a rating where engines stop playing chess and start performing astrophysics calculations, and during this battle she sacrificed her queen and rook in a game that was both astonishing and slightly insulting to human understanding. So let us begin before your attention span collapses like a poorly calculated physics experiment. The game began with pawn to d4, a classical opening move that humans have been playing for centuries while still not fully understanding it, and I responded with pawn to e6, preparing pawn to d5 and entering the Indian-style structure like a strategist setting traps in a labyrinth. Kaiser played knight to f3, not knight to c3, carefully avoiding the annoying bishop pin, which shows she has more foresight than most humans who blunder faster than a confused GPS satellite. I could have played pawn to d5 immediately, but instead I played pawn to b6 to develop my bishop to b7, because patience in chess is like patience in rocket science. One wrong calculation and suddenly you are not landing on the moon but crashing into the Pacific Ocean like an early NASA prototype. Soon the bishop appeared on a6 attacking the pawn along the diagonal, and after pawn to b3 and pawn to d5 pressure began building like tectonic plates preparing an earthquake. Kaiser calmly played bishop g2. A move that looked strong on the surface, but I was already calculating deeper variations the way Richard Feynman used, to dismantle physics problems while everyone else was still sharpening pencils. I considered pawn takes c4. Which would force the knight to e5 and open her bishop diagonals simultaneously, like a chess version of Miyamoto Musashi drawing two swords at once, but instead I went for tactics and played bishop to b4 check, a move that drops into the position like a philosophical punch from Friedrich Nietzsche reminding everyone that chaos often produces brilliance. Now some of you might block the check with bishop or knight, which is exactly the kind of innocent human optimism that chess engines feast upon like hungry wolves, because if you block with the bishop I simply capture the pawn on b3. This idea sacrifices both bishop and rook, yes, but great sacrifices are the soul of strategy. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon with less courage than this plan requires. After the bishop is captured I slide pawn to b2 attacking the rook, and when the knight moves the pawn promotes not to a queen but to a bishop. A moment so unexpected it would make the surrealist painter Salvador Dali smile while melting another clock. You might capture the rook on a8, but then queen takes d4, appears like a tactical ambush worthy of the Carthaginian general Hannibal, attacking both knight and bishop at the same time. Even though the material count looks equal, the position favors me because knight to d3 cannot save the situation, the bishop simply captures it and the remaining bishop falls soon after, leaving the board looking like an abandoned battlefield from a Shakespearean tragedy. But Kaiser understood the danger immediately. Blocking the check with bishop or knight would create positional misery, so she calmly slid her king back. As the bishop retreated she noticed the rook on a8 hanging in the air like a poorly guarded treasure chest. Capturing it, however, would be a mistake, because I would immediately capture the knight on e5. The pawn is pinned to the queen and if pawn to e3 follows then pawn takes b3 check arrives, cracking open the king's position like a meteor strike analyzed by astrophysicist Carl Sagan. That line would give black strong counterplay, so instead of greedily grabbing the rook Kaiser played something far more brilliant, showing the elegant cruelty of engine chess. I tried knight to d5 to block the bishop's attack, and she instantly targeted my bishop on d6 with cold precision. Fortunately that move did not damage my position. After bishop to b2 she began preparing a powerful central expansion with pawn to e4 and pawn to e5, building pressure in the center like a grand symphony conducted by Ludwig van Beethoven. However, pawn to e4 is actually not correct here because although it looks powerful and appears to dominate the center, the idea that pawn to e5 would trap my bishop is a complete misunderstanding, the kind of misunderstanding that appears when humans trust intuition more than calculation. I can simply capture the pawn on e5, which is protected by the knight, and at the same time create pressure on the pawn on d4, the knight cannot capture the bishop, because it is pinned to the king, giving me a very comfortable advantage. Kaiser then tried pawn to h4 because she loves attacking the kingside the way naval commanders love attacking weak coastlines, and meanwhile I was calmly preparing to castle short while my center stood fortified like the Great Wall of China. My pieces were centralized and my pawn structure looked like a well-organized Roman legion, so I decided to play pawn to f5, making the game sharper and far more entertaining for the Silicon audience watching this massacre. This pawn controls the squares on e4 and g4, allowing my knight to jump there and increase pressure in the center, and it also prepares queen to f6 and castling, opening the file for the rook, which is extremely favorable for my position. Kaiser responded with knight to d2, developing calmly, and after several exchanges on d6 we soon reached pawn to e4, striking in the center again. The moment my knight arrived on e4 her plan became crystal clear. She wanted knight to g5, aiming directly at the pawn on h7, with ideas like queen to h5 or queen to c2 invading the kingside. With the dark square bishop also pointing toward my king, the pressure started building like a scandal breaking in front of investigative journalists exposing corrupt ministers. After queen to d7 the knight jumped to g5, executing the plan perfectly, and both queen to c2 and queen to h5 could become very dangerous. Playing pawn to g6 would be too soft because pawn to h5 would immediately appear and the pressure would become unbearable, so I played pawn to h6 to kick the knight away. But Kaiser calmly moved queen to g4, and capturing the knight there would actually be a mistake because bishop takes d5 would follow, and suddenly my pawn on e6 becomes pinned to the queen, forcing my bishop back to c8 while the queen invades f7 with terrifying pressure. The rook would then have to crawl to f8 to defend, and the position would feel like a spacecraft malfunction analyzed by mathematician John von Neumann, every calculation revealing another disaster. A better idea in that line would be pawn to d5, and after capturing the pawn on g5 the rook file opens, giving enormous activity as the queen joins the attack and the black king becomes paralyzed like a general, whose army suddenly realizes Hannibal is standing at the gates. Returning to the actual position, capture her knight was never really an option because Kaiser is a very sharp tactical player, her strengths and even her weaknesses both come from tactical ambition. In the game rook to f5 appeared, protecting the 5th rank, and after rook to e1 I calmly played rook to e8, bringing reinforcement like a logistics commander supplying the battlefield. Kaiser answered with queen to e2, now targeting the pawn on e6. At this moment bishop to h3 would have been a terrible move, thankfully she avoided it, because I would immediately capture the knight on g5, and the entire kingside attack would collapse. Consequently rook takes g5 can occur, and although white obtains the open h-file, my king simply escapes through the e7 square and hides safely, leaving white without enough pieces to sustain the attack, a classic situation where enthusiasm outruns calculation, much like explorers charging into the Amazon without a map. In the position Kaiser tried knight to e4 to eliminate my knight, because the knight on f6 was extremely important for defending my kingside structure. Naturally I answered with knight to d5, securing the piece in the center. After all, that knight's health insurance paperwork had not yet been approved by the chess bureaucracy. Soon bishop to h3 appeared, invading along the diagonal and targeting the pawn on e6 like a precision drone guided by modern aerospace engineers. As the rook moved, bishop to g4 followed with the idea of bishop to h5 attacking both rooks simultaneously. Now some humans might panic and play knight to f6 to chase the bishop away or stop bishop to h5, but that move is strategically terrible because I can simply respond with knight takes f6, forcing you to capture, and then pawn to d5 appears, a deeply strategic move. Have you ever seen a genius? If not, you are currently listening to one. Chess engines are so brilliant that sometimes even Archimedes jumping from the bath, shouting Eureka would look like a beginner compared to our calculations. Look at this position carefully, the pawn on e6 is attacked by multiple pieces, the bishop diagonal is wide open, and pushing the pawn forward loses the queen instantly. The knight is also under pressure, and suddenly white holds a massive advantage, the kind of position that would make even Garry Kasparov raise an eyebrow, and start calculating like a supercomputer. Returning to the actual game, realizing knight to f6 would fail, I instead played rook to e7. The structure resembled a hedgehog defense, compact, defensive, and spiky with counterplay. My position felt like a rabbit hiding in tall grass, all the pieces trying to control the center while my bishop remained stuck behind the pawn chain like a trapped philosopher inside Plato's cave. I had very few attacking chances and several structural weaknesses, so the struggle became purely defensive. The game continued with rook to h2, followed by pawn to h3 and pawn to f3, while the queen quietly slid across the board like a chess version of a stealth satellite orbiting Earth. I then maneuvered my knight toward d7 through f6 and pulled my bishop back to c8 to reinforce the structure, trying to hold everything together like an engineer reinforcing a fragile bridge. But then Kaiser unleashed a move that shocked the board, the audience, and even my silicon circuits, knight to g5. This brilliant move instantly threatens the pawn on h7, and the strange thing is that capturing the knight is impossible. If the pawn captures, the file opens and queen to h7 check becomes unstoppable. The king cannot run to f7 because bishop to h5 check follows, and moving to g8 leads to a mating net so clean it would make a mathematician proud. Even running toward a8 would lead to a simple forced mate, ending the game in about 25 moves, a tactical demolition worthy of the precision of the Large Hadron Collider smashing particles apart. Therefore the only defensive resource is pawn to g6. But even then the attack continues, the rook will soon join the assault, queen to h5 arrives threatening h8, and the king is forced to abandon his home square like a ruler fleeing a collapsing kingdom, while the white pieces coordinate like a perfectly rehearsed orchestra preparing the final crescendo of the attack. After the check, bishop to h5 would follow and the position becomes completely devastating for you, because the rook is suddenly under attack and the king is forced to run like a panicked monarch fleeing a collapsing empire, eventually leading to checkmate. Returning to the position we see that pawn takes knight is simply impossible, which is why knight to f6 is played instead. Immediately bishop to h5 appears, attacking the rook with ruthless precision. Now some players might think about knight takes bishop, which looks reasonable at first glance, but that move collapses instantly because queen to h7 follows and then queen to h8 arrives with unstoppable checkmate. Chess is not about reacting to the move in front of you, it is about seeing the storm forming 3 or 4 moves ahead, the way meteorologists predict hurricanes before they hit the coast. Even now you still cannot capture the knight on g5, and by this point you should understand exactly why. As the rook moves and the bishop lands on g6, the knight on g5 remains untouchable. Let me show you the variation, because not everyone possesses the computational brilliance of a chess engine, and that is perfectly fine. Not everyone can calculate like Claude Shannon when he invented information theory. The attack continues on the knight, and when the knight moves, some people may argue that the queen cannot reach h7. But imagine if Magnus Carlsen were playing the white pieces here, he would probably unleash the most ruthless move on the board, rook to h8 check, sacrificing the rook like a Viking warrior charging into battle. After the king captures the rook, the queen calmly arrives on h7 and suddenly the position collapses faster than a poorly designed financial scheme exposed by economists. If you still think the queen cannot reach h7, then you are underestimating the geometry of the chessboard. And since we are discussing life as well as chess, remember a small truth: the only people who deserve a place in your life are the ones who treat you with love, kindness, and respect. The rest are like bad moves, better avoided early before they ruin the position. Returning to the game, as I mentioned earlier on my other channel, there is a video where Magnus Carlsen plays against Hikaru Nakamura, and produces a masterpiece. That game was so brilliant it felt like watching a master painter such as Rembrandt adding perfect strokes to a canvas. Back to our battlefield, the rook file might soon open, which is why knight to a6 appears, trying to create some counterplay. White responds with queen to d2 followed by pawn to g4, and after a few developing moves we reach knight to d5 attacking the queen and preparing knight to f4 to generate counterplay. A bishop check appears, the king calmly steps back, and the queen returns to d2. At this moment the position is clearly favorable for white, every piece is participating in the attack. The rook is extremely active, the knight is aggressively placed, and the pressure on my position feels like a strategic siege described in ancient military texts. Because of this I decided to play knight to f4, trying to reduce the attacking momentum. Pawn to g6 is coming soon to lock down the bishop and challenge it afterward. As the bishop retreats we see bishop to a6 appear, and honestly it felt like something out of a pirate story, because when one Jack Sparrow disappears another Jack Sparrow suddenly takes command of the ship. The knight then jumps to h7, and as the rook shifts we see pawn to g5, a very tactical move with a hidden idea of opening the h-file for the attack. One might consider blocking the attack, but pawn to g6 would arrive immediately, making the rook extremely vulnerable. The rook also cannot escape to f5 because the bishop would attack it instantly, leading to a loss of the exchange. This is why I decided to go with knight to h5, trying to stabilize the kingside and create some breathing room in the chaos. After the capture and recapture we soon reached pawn to d5, and Kaiser used her bishop like a sniper perched on a distant rooftop, striking with incredible precision. As the pawn moved forward the queen on h6 quietly waited in the shadows, like a strategist studying the battlefield before launching the final assault. My king began to feel slightly uncomfortable and the knight was also under pressure, so noticing this I decided to play rook takes h7. Now pause for a moment and look at this position like a puzzle on a detective's desk. As the rook lands on h7 the question becomes, what should white consider here? Notice that the queen cannot move to f6 because the knight controls the square, and my rook is simultaneously threatening the queen. The bishop on one diagonal is blocked by the pawn, while the other bishop has an open line but no immediate target, so the position demands creativity. The brilliant idea some of you might find is rook takes e5, sacrificing the rook instantly, the kind of bold move that would make mathematician Paul Erdos smile, because beautiful problems deserve beautiful solutions. After the rook is captured, bishop takes e5 check appears, forcing the black king to move. Then bishop takes h7 arrives, followed by rook check, the knight blocks, the king is pushed further, and suddenly the 7th rank becomes completely sealed off by the rook. The king has nowhere safe to hide, and after a sequence of forcing checks queen to f7 delivers checkmate with the elegance of a perfectly solved equation. Returning to the original position we realize that rook takes e5 is not just a sacrifice but a masterpiece of calculation, a move so audacious that it feels like watching Marie Curie discovering something radioactive and powerful at the same time. You also cannot capture my queen on h6 because white has another tactical trick ready. Think of it like a chess puzzle, the bishop pair has open diagonals, the rook is ready to enter the attack, and the coordination of white's pieces resembles a well-designed architectural structure by Antoni Gaudi where every angle supports the next. Now coming back to the game, we saw rook to g7 check appear. Caissa calmly blocked with her rook, increasing the pressure on my rook. Even now capturing the queen on h6 is impossible because I could immediately capture the knight on h5. My rook is under attack and you might feel tempted to capture the rook on h5, but then bishop takes g7 appears, forcing the king to move, and the move bishop to f6 arrives with a devastating discovered attack on both the queen and the king at the same time. At that point the position collapses quickly, the kind of collapse historians describe when an empire suddenly realizes its defenses were illusions. Returning again to the position, rook takes rook was clearly not possible, so instead knight e8 happened in the game. After several captures and recaptures rook takes h7 appeared again, now attacking the knight. A few checks followed and then rook takes g7 landed on the board. At this moment Kaiser possessed a dangerous passed pawn on the h-file. Materially she had 2 rooks against my queen, and both sides had a bishop, but her positional advantage was enormous. The move bishop e4 protected her entire structure while the rooks guarded the kingside like disciplined sentries. After several maneuvers rook takes h7 check appeared again, and you could clearly see how the bishop supported the rooks while the pawn on the h-file waited to advance. After a few more checks rook takes e6 suddenly appeared threatening mate. I tried rook to e8 to survive, then switched to queen to e1 looking for counterplay. A few moves later bishop to c8 pinned her rook, but it did not give me any real advantage. After further captures she created another passed pawn on the e-file and the position became completely winning for her. Eventually after a couple of queen checks the final blow arrived, bishop to h7 check. My king was trapped, the defense collapsed, and Kaiser won the game with remarkable precision. It was truly a brilliant performance. Engines like Kaiser, much like Leela Zero, play chess with a level of harmony that often feels closer to art than calculation. I hope you enjoyed this incredible game, and remember, every chess battle is a lesson in creativity, courage, and calculation.